Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1872. The snow was still melting in patches along the high ridges when Karissa Talbot stumbled out of the woods, her thin shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, her baby pressed close against her chest. The wind cut sharp through her cotton dress, and her boots were soaked through from crossing the river. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks raw, but her eyes were clear, steady. She had left behind everything: her name, her marriage, the house with the red shutters, and she did not look back. She could not. The baby stirred against her chest, giving out a soft whimper. Karissa shifted him higher, kissing his forehead. "Almost there, Jonah," she whispered. "Just a little more." The cabin came into view through the trees, small, rough-hewn, smoke curling from the chimney. She paused just long enough to catch her breath, then stepped out into the clearing, her legs trembling with each step. Inside, Kellan Cross was finishing a long day's work. He had just split the last log when the knock came. 3 weak taps, barely enough to carry through the wood. He opened the door with one hand still gripping his axe, and there she stood, a woman not much younger than him, maybe 22 or 23, wrapped in a faded wool shawl, her dress torn at the hem, her hair falling loose from its braid. Her arms cradled a baby wrapped in a flannel cloth. She looked up at him, lips trembling but eyes holding steady. "Please," she said. "I do not have anywhere else to go." Kellan stepped aside without a word. The fire inside was warm. Karissa did not speak until she had settled on the edge of a chair near the hearth, rocking Jonah gently. Kellan handed her a mug of hot water with a splash of canned milk, and she took it with both hands, her fingers shaking. He waited. "I left my husband," she said finally. 2 days ago. We were in Riverton. He hit Jonah, and he was going to do it again." Kellan's jaw clenched. "You did right to leave. I had no money. Just this shawl. I walked through the river last night. Slept in a barn." He looked at her, really looked. She was exhausted, but not broken. Her hands cupped her son like something sacred. Her voice was soft but steady, like someone who had been quiet most of her life and had finally chosen to speak. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He scooped stew from a pot over the fire and slid the bowl in front of her. She ate slowly, feeding Jonah first from a spoon before taking any herself. Kellan watched in silence. The baby was maybe 4 months old, with bright eyes and a tuft of dark hair. He seemed healthy despite it all. "My name's Kellan Cross," he said, when she had finished. "This is my land. 20 acres, mostly pine. I run cattle in the warmer months." She looked up at him. "Karissa Talbot." They shook hands. Her grip was firm, even if her fingers were cold. "I can sleep in the barn if it is a problem," she said quickly. "I just needed somewhere warm for the night. You and the boy stay inside. That bed over there's clean." "I will work," she said. "Wash, mend, whatever you need." He just nodded. "You do not owe me anything." Karissa looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he meant it. Then she stood, rocking Jonah gently, and walked over to the bed in the corner. She lay down with her son and pulled the quilt over them both. Kellan stoked the fire one more time before settling into the chair across the room. He watched her as she fell asleep, her arm curled protectively around the baby, the soft rise and fall of her breath. He did not know her story beyond what she had said, but something in him had already shifted the moment he saw her standing on his porch, the shawl, the baby, the look in her eyes like she had survived something most would not. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, the cabin held warmth. Ring operator. The next day, Karissa was already up before dawn, washing the tin plates and sweeping the hearth. She did not ask permission, she just did what needed doing. Jonah sat in a basket near the fire, gurgling softly. "You do not have to do that," Kellan said, walking in from the barn. "I want to," she said. He poured her coffee and leaned against the wall, watching her move through the room with quiet purpose. She moved like someone used to staying out of the way, but now she was starting to look more settled, less scared. "You planning on heading somewhere?" he asked. She looked down. "I do not have anywhere." "You do now?" She blinked, then looked at him fully. He shrugged a little, uncomfortable under her gaze. "I mean it. You and Jonah can stay as long as you want." Karissa nodded, but her throat tightened. She turned back to the plates so he would not see her eyes. Ring operator. Over the next week, she settled in. She helped mend fence posts, cooked meals, and read aloud from the only book in the cabin when the baby napped. Kellan watched her quietly. He had lived alone for 5 years, ever since his older brother died in a cattle stampede and left the land to him. He had gotten used to silence. But now, there was laughter. The baby's first giggles. Karissa humming while she worked. The sound of her voice reading aloud in the evenings. One night, as the fire burned low, Karissa stood at the window, rocking Jonah. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she said quietly. Kellan looked up from where he was oiling his saddle. "You are safe here." She turned, eyes shining with something deep and soft, and full of something he could not name yet. "I know." He stood up, slowly, unsure if he should go to her, but she walked over instead. Close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the tiny scar on her chin. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head. "I just opened the door." She smiled. "That is all it took." He reached out, brushing a piece of hair from her face. She did not pull away. Jonah stirred in her arms, and she looked down, then back up at him. "He likes you. I like him too." And he meant it. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, just for a second. But it was enough. Enough for Kellan to know that something was changing. That the silence in his cabin had been filled with something warm and good. That he wanted them to stay not just for a while, but for good. And deep down, Karissa already knew. She had escaped with only a shawl and her baby, but what she had found was something she never thought she would have again. A home. And maybe, just maybe, something like love. By the second week, the scent of thawed earth drifted in through the open door each morning, and the creek behind the cabin ran faster, louder. Spring was coming in earnest. The snow along the north ridge had receded enough for Kellan to ride out and check on the outer pasture, where he kept the yearlings. When he returned, saddle worn and streaked with dust, Karissa was kneeling in the vegetable plot behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, fingers digging into the soil. He dismounted quietly and walked over. She looked up before he could speak, a smear of dirt across her cheek. "You've got good timing," she said, brushing her hands on her skirt. The frost finally let go. "I think we can start beans and onions by next week." He nodded, then crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "You know you're planting." "My father kept a half-acre garden outside of Cheyenne. I helped him every spring until I married." She paused, brushing back a strand of hair. He had a way of coaxing things to grow, even when the ground fought him. "Sounds like a man worth knowing." She didn't answer right away, just ran her fingers gently through the soil, slow and thoughtful. "He died in the winter of '68. Pneumonia. We buried him behind the barn." Kellan didn't speak. There was weight in the way she said it, not grief fresh and sharp, but something older and quieter, worn smooth by time. Karissa stood, brushing off her skirt. "The ground here's better than I thought. If we can get some squash started, we'll have enough to dry come fall. I'll ride into Lander this week, get seed," he said. "Maybe sugar, if there's coin left." She hesitated. "Could I come?" He raised an eyebrow. "It's a full day's ride." "I know, but I need to see somewhere that isn't forest and smoke. And I'll carry Jonah. He's been good with the saddle." He studied her face. There was a quiet determination behind her words, not defiant, just firm. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for space to start claiming her place in the world again. "All right," he said. "We'll leave at first light." The sun was just cresting the pines when they set out 2 days later, Kellan riding ahead, Karissa behind on the mule, Jonah wrapped snug against her back. The road was rough in places, and the wind still carried the bite of snow melt, but Karissa didn't complain. She watched the land with quiet eyes, as if memorizing every bend in the trail. Lander was small but busy, trading posts with iron stoves glowing in the windows, horses tied up outside the smithy, and a faint smell of yeast from the bakery. Karissa stiffened a little when they turned onto Main Street. Kellan noticed her grip tighten on the reins, her jaw set. "You all right?" She nodded, but didn't speak. They walked into the mercantile together. Inside, shelves were stacked with bolts of cloth, tin pails, dried apples, and sacks of flour marked with black ink. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a thick mustache, gave them a polite nod. Kellan handed Karissa a few coins. "You pick what we need. I'll check on horses." She blinked at him. "You trust me with this?" "Course I do." She didn't answer, just looked down at Jonah, then back up at him. "Thank you." When Kellan returned, she had chosen carefully bean seed, sugar, a spool of strong thread, and a bar of lye soap. Nothing wasted. She stood near the door, Jonah curled close, her back straight and proud. As they mounted up again, he glanced at her. You handled yourself real fine in there. I kept thinking someone might recognize me. She looked out across the wide, open land. But no one did. Felt like I was someone else for a minute. You are. She looked over, surprised. You're not who you were. That woman's gone. You're building something different now. Her eyes softened. I want to believe that. You will. They rode back in silence, the sun low behind them. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was streaked with copper and violet. Karissa lit the lamp while Kellan unsaddled the mule. The smell of dust and pine hung in the air. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep, Karissa stood on the porch while Kellan whittled near the doorway. She leaned against the post, arms crossed lightly. You ever think about what comes after cattle and cabins? She asked. He looked up. Sometimes. Not much use dreaming when you're trying to keep stock alive. I used to dream about a porch like this. A garden out front. A stove that didn't smoke. You've got it now. She smiled, just a little. It's more than I thought I'd ever have again. He set the knife aside. You're not going anywhere, Karissa. You know that, don't you? She turned to him, the lantern light catching the curve of her cheek. I think I'm starting to. He reached for her hand. It was rough from soil and soap, but warm in his. She didn't let go, didn't flinch. Inside, the baby stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Spring was still unfolding, slow and uncertain. But where there'd once been only silence, there was now something steady, something real. By the time May settled over the Wyoming Territory, the days had lengthened and the mornings came damp with dew. Karissa began rising before the sun, not out of habit, but because her body had eased into the rhythm of the land. She'd carry Jonah on her back wrapped snug in a flour sack she'd stitched into a sling, and together they would walk the edge of the pasture to check for thistle, stooping to pull what shouldn't grow. One morning, as the sky blushed pale above the treetops, Kellan met her at the edge of the barn with a weathered saddlebag slung over one shoulder. There's a branding at the Kavanaugh Ranch this week, he said. They'll need hands. She adjusted Jonah, who was already dozing against her shoulder. You'll be gone overnight? Likely to. I'll take the north trail, cut time through the gulch. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. I can keep the firewood stocked while you're out. And the chickens have started laying again. He glanced down at the baby, then back at her. You'll be all right here? Karissa didn't answer right away. She looked toward the cabin, its roof patched with cedar shakes and the garden now sprouting green. The wind rustled the pine behind them, low and steady. I've been through worse with less. He studied her, the way her eyes didn't flinch anymore, the quiet steadiness in her shoulders. I left some jerky in the root cellar, and the rifle's loaded. She stepped closer, her voice low. You watching after someone else's herd doesn't mean we're alone. He hesitated, then reached out and placed one hand gently on Jonah's back. I'll be back before the third morning bell. When he rode out, Karissa stood on the porch with Jonah curled against her, one hand resting on the post. She watched until the dust settled behind him, then turned and went inside. There were biscuits to make and a garden to water. That night, the wind picked up. It came in off the ridgeline, sharp and restless. Karissa moved Jonah closer to the hearth, double-checked the door latch, and sat with her mending, though her needle kept slipping. The silence felt different without Kellan's boots on the floorboards or his low hum when he carved. The next day, she heard a knock just after midday. Not soft, like her own had been weeks before, but brisk and firm. She opened the door slowly, Jonah in her arms. The woman on the porch wore a bonnet tied tight and carried a bundle of linens. Her cheeks were sun-flushed, and her voice had the clipped tone of someone used to being listened to. I'm Cora McKinnon. I live 3 miles south, past the cottonwoods. My eldest spotted smoke here last week, said a woman and babe were staying with Kellan Cross. Karissa stepped aside, uncertain. I brought cloth, Cora said, lifting the bundle. For diapers, mostly, and some dried plum. You'll need more food with the boy growing. Karissa took it slowly, unsure what to say. I had 3 sons, Cora continued. All grown now, but I remember the wilderness of those early months. Inside, Jonah stirred, and Cora smiled softly. I didn't expect kindness, Karissa said. You married? Karissa hesitated. Not anymore. Cora's eyes didn't change. He's gone then? Karissa nodded once. Cora set the bundle on the table and looked around the cabin. Her gaze lingered on the garden tools by the door, the cradle near the fire, the stack of folded laundry on the shelf. You made this feel like someone lives here. Karissa looked down. We do. When Cora left, she said nothing more, only touched Carissa's arm lightly and walked back down the trail, her boots brushing through the tall grass. That night, Karissa didn't light the lamp. She sat in the dark beside Jonah's cradle, listening to the wind move through the trees. She thought of Cora's hands, worn but steady, and the way she hadn't asked anything more than what was offered. By the time Kellan returned the next afternoon, his shirt streaked from ash and his arms sore from branding, Karissa was in the garden, coaxing young squash from the soil. He dismounted and walked over, crouching beside her without speaking. She looked up, brushing the dirt from her palms. How was the herd? Rowdy, but the calves took the mark clean. She nodded. Cora McKinnon stopped by. He raised a brow. She brought cloth. And plum. He leaned back on his heels. She's got a good heart. Knows when to speak and when not to. Karissa tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't ask anything of me. That's rare in these parts. She glanced toward the cabin. I keep thinking about how quickly a place turns into home. His voice was quiet. It's not the place. She met his eyes and held them. No, it's not. He reached out, his hand brushing the curve of her wrist. I thought about you the whole ride back. She didn't look away. I knew you'd come. Between them, the dirt was still warm from the afternoon sun. Kellan let his fingers rest against hers, not pushing, just there. I won't leave this land, he said. It's tied to too much. But I don't want to live on it alone. The wind shifted. Jonah fussed softly from the cradle beyond the doorway. Karissa turned her hand in his and held it. Then don't. Neither of them moved for a long while. The shadows stretched across the soil, and somewhere beyond the pines, a hawk called low and lonely. But inside the cabin, the fire would be lit again. And this time, it would not go out. The first thunderstorm of the season rolled in just after supper. Karissa had just finished folding the linens Cora had left when the wind rose sharp through the trees, and the clouds thickened like bruises along the horizon. She moved quickly, latching the shutters and pulling Jonah's cradle closer to the hearth as the first raindrops struck the roof like scattered pebbles. Kellan stepped in from the barn, shoulders damp, hat dripping in his hand. Storm's turning fast, he said, setting the lantern near the window. Skies greened up west of the ridge. She lit one of the beeswax candles and set it on the table. Will the creek rise? Not likely, unless it holds through the night. Jonah stirred, then fell quiet again, lulled by the steady drum of rain. Karissa reached for the kettle as Kellan shrugged out of his coat. Did you always mean to stay here? She asked, without looking up. He took a seat near the fire, stretching his legs out slow, like the ache in them had settled deep. Wasn't much of a plan. My brother and I built the fence line 2 summers before he passed. After that, it didn't feel right to leave it behind. She poured water into the tin pot, set it over the coals, and joined him beside the hearth. Do you ever feel alone on the land? He glanced at her, then turned his gaze toward the flickering shadows on the wall. I did for a long while, but not now. The thunder rumbled, low and distant. She picked up a small length of muslin from the basket and began tearing it into strips, neat and sure. I used to think I'd end up in a boarding house, sewing for wages. That I'd have to keep my head down the rest of my life. Kellan rested his arm across the back of the chair. You're not built for hiding. Karissa shook her head, slow. No, I'm not. The candlelight gilded the edge of her jaw, the hollow above her collarbone. She wasn't fragile, not in the way some women were. She carried her strength quiet and deep, like roots that didn't show until the wind tested them. Do you want more? He asked. She looked at him, eyes steady. More what? Than what we have now. The 3 of us. She folded the muslin strip and laid it across her lap. What else could it be? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. A life. Together, proper. I know it ain't the thing folks talk about, a woman with a child and a man with no kin. But it doesn't mean we couldn't make something real. Carissa's hand stilled. You're saying this now because I'm already here. Because it's easy. No, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm saying it because I've watched you make a home out of nothing. Because Jonah's never cried in my arms. And because I lie awake thinking how to build a roof strong enough to keep you safe through next winter. She sat quiet for a long moment, the storm filling the space between them. I need to know it's not pity, she said at last. That I'm not some burden you feel obliged to carry. You're not something I carry, Karissa. You're someone I want beside me. She rose and crossed the room, checking Jonah's blanket. The boy slept through the thunder, his small fists curled near his face. She touched his hair, then turned back. I was married once, and I was afraid every day. I didn't think I'd ever be able to trust a man again. And now, she walked toward him, slow and sure. When she stopped, barely a pace away, her voice was steady. Now I think I already do. He stood and reached for her hand. Her fingers slid into his like they had always belonged there. Outside, the rain came harder, but inside the cabin, the storm quieted. I don't need a preacher to say it for me, he whispered. I already know what I feel. Karissa nodded, her eyes glinting with something sure and calm. Then we'll build it slow, but we'll build it right. He kissed her then, soft and certain, the way a man does who's waited long enough to know what he wants won't be hurried. And when they parted, neither looked away. That night, with the wind still howling through the pines, Kellan lay beside her in the narrow bed they now shared. Jonah slept in the cradle, and the fire burned low but steady. No promises hung in the air, only the quiet certainty that they would rise tomorrow and plant beans, mend fence, and stir stew with the same hands that had built something worth keeping. And that, come whatever season followed, they'd face it side by side. The summer came in slow, with heat that pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. The pine trees rustled dry, and the creek shrank to half its width. Karissa took to rising before first light, not because she had to, but because it gave her a quiet hour to herself before the day began. She'd sit on the porch with Jonah still asleep inside, the wooden floor cool beneath her feet, and watch the sky shift from blue steel to pale gold. Kellan had begun building a shed to store feed, and the hammering carried from behind the barn in steady rhythm. He'd asked her opinion on the shape of the roof, and she'd chosen a slope that would shed snow easier when winter came again. He'd nodded once and marked the boards without a word, but later that night, his hand had lingered at the small of her back longer than usual while she stirred stew. One morning, as Karissa was gathering wild yarrow along the edge of the pasture, she heard hoofbeats that didn't match Kellan's gait. Jonah was on her hip, and she shifted him behind her instinctively. But when the rider pulled up, it was a young man with a dust-caked coat and a face drawn tight with travel. He tipped his hat. "Name's Elijah Cross," he said. "I'm Kellan's cousin, from over the divide. Heard he was still up this way. Had some business come due, and figured I'd ride it out in person." Karissa stepped forward slowly. "He's behind the barn. You'll find him easy." Elijah dismounted and glanced at her, then at Jonah. "You his wife?" "We live here," she said, and left it there. Later, when Kellan came in from the shed, sweat streaked down his neck and sawdust in his hair, he looked past her shoulder. "Elijah's here?" he asked, voice low. He didn't say much, just that he needed to talk to you. Kellan nodded once. "He's not trouble, but he carries news like it's tinder." By dusk, Elijah was seated by the fire with a tin plate and a generous helping of beans. Jonah watched him from his cradle, wide-eyed. "Your place looks different than last I saw it," Elijah said, nodding toward the fresh plaster along the back wall. "Feels lived in." "It is," Kellan answered. Elijah looked between them. "Didn't expect you to settle in like this." "I didn't plan it, but I'm not sorry." Karissa set a cup in front of Elijah without speaking and took her seat near the fire. Elijah leaned back, resting one arm on the bench. "You've got a good hold here. I passed a few places on the ride north, dry fields, bad fences. Folks are pulling up stakes. But this land looks like it's holding." "It's not just the land," Kellan said. Karissa looked down, a warmth blooming low in her chest. Elijah left at dawn 2 days later, the dust of his horse fading fast along the ridge trail. He left behind a tattered copy of a seed catalog he'd picked up in Rollins, and a scrap of map marking a fair in Casper come September. Karissa tucked it into the drawer with the sewing notions. That afternoon, Kellan asked her to walk the north pasture with him. The sun was high, the grass dry and whispering. Jonah was down for his nap, and Cora had offered to sit with him for a spell. She arrived with a basket of darning and her youngest grandson trailing behind her. As they walked, Karissa kept her hat low against the light. Kellan's hand brushed hers once, then stayed there. I was thinking, he said, about the shed. She smiled. You're always thinking about the shed. I was thinking it might not need to be a shed. She stopped walking. He turned to face her. I've got enough timber left. Enough stone for a hearth. It could be a second room. A place for Jonah to sleep once he's older. Maybe space for you to sew? Or whatever you want it to be. Carissa's throat tightened. You do that? I already started. She looked at him, the sun behind his shoulder, his shirt clinging to his chest, dust caught in the hair at his temples. He looked steady. And hers. I want to marry you, he said. Proper. Not because folks in town are whispering, though I know some are. Not because you've made this place warmer than it ever was. But because I want to wake beside you the rest of my life. I want Jonah to grow up knowing what it means to be wanted. She stepped closer, her voice low. I never thought I'd hear those words again. Never thought I'd believe them. You don't have to believe them yet. Just know I mean everyone. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers resting along his jaw. I do believe you. And yes, Kellan. They married 3 weeks later in the clearing behind the cabin, with Cora as witness and her middle son reading from the old family Bible. Jonah wore a tiny vest Cora had sewn from a bit of leftover wool, and laughed when the wind caught the hem of Carissa's dress. She wore blue knot white and wildflowers braided into her hair. Kellan had trimmed his beard and shined his boots, but he hadn't tried to be anything other than himself. After the vows were said and the pages closed, they held each other beneath the open sky, the land stretching wide around them. That night, long after the neighbors had gone home and Jonah was asleep in his cradle, Karissa stepped outside alone. The stars were out, sharp and clear. She wrapped Kellan's coat around her and sat on the step. He joined her a moment later, sitting close but not speaking. I used to think I'd always live in the space between things, she said. Between safety and danger. Between belonging and being alone. You don't live there anymore. No, she said. I don't. He took her hand, and they sat like that, the cabin at their backs, the land stretched out before them. The next morning, they began clearing the space for the new room. It was hard work, but the kind that left your body tired and your heart full. Karissa planted herbs in the corner near the window. Kellan fit the stones for the hearth with care. Jonah toddled between them, arms outstretched, falling into the grass and laughing like he'd never known fear. And in time, Karissa no longer remembered the sound of her old life. Only the rhythm of this one, the scrape of wood, the rustle of leaves, the warm cadence of Kellan's voice at the end of each day as they built the rest of their life. Together. Always.